everyone, and welcome to Open Door Philosophy, a podcast for a high school philosophy teacher, that's me, and his former student who's currently studying philosophy in college,
that's me.
Unpack a variety of big philosophical concepts in an understandable way, all towards the purpose of living a good life. Welcome to episode 10. Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm doing excellent. I just finished up my last week of finals, so life is a lot less stressed than it was in the last episode. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I will not go into all the drama of the last couple weeks of school, but let's just say I have looked very forward to the weekends, and all is well. I will say from a natural standpoint, our backyard right now, like we love gardening, and our backyard right now, I would say is at peak springtime bloom. It is just absolutely gorgeous outside. The grass is a deep green, and all the plants are, at least the spring blooming plants, are in full bloom. And there's bees and there's hummingbirds, and it's just really wonderful in the backyard. But how's your yard? Tell me about your yard, Andrew.
I'm not a gardener. I guess it looks good. I really been. For the past few days, I guess everyone who's listening won't know this, but I've been, in about a month time from now, I will be taking the LSAT. So I have been crammed up inside my room studying logic puzzles and such like a good philosopher. So I have not, unfortunately, had much time to go outside, but maybe when this episode drops, we can put a picture up on our Instagram at Open Door Philosophy, and people can check out what we're talking about. Oh, sure. That would actually be great.
Henry David Thoreau would recommend a walk for you.
I'll take him up on his advice.
A short walk would help the mind. So last night is really interesting when we let the dogs out for the evening, for that last visit to the yard before we go to bed. Our little dog, Alfred, he's a Chihuahua Terrier mix. Man, he shot towards the grill and pulled something out, and it was about the size of a large rat, but it was a small possum, an adolescent possum, and of course, it's so cool. You always hear the phrase, well, I don't know if you always hear the phrase, but playing possum, which is like playing like you're dead. Kirsten was like, "Oh my gosh," and I was like, "No, it's okay." And that little possum was just laying there, completely lifeless. and Alfred hadn't done anything to the possum; he just dragged him out. Like the possum wasn't hurt, but he was playing possum. And so, we got the dogs back inside, and we stood there. And about 30 seconds later, that little guy hopped right up and just scampered off. I was like, nature's cool. That's so cool.
That's so funny.
I even read once, I could totally be wrong on this, but I even read once, when possums are playing dead, that they stop their hearts.
Oh my God.
And their breathing, so that the predator really believes that they're dead.
That's a bit of an overkill, it seems, but I guess whatever works,
Overkill. That's a good joke. All right. Well, before we dive into the depths of this episode, Andrew, this is episode 10. We made it.
It's exciting.
It is exciting. And I know this isn't an anniversary necessarily, but I did look up, what is the traditional gift for 10th anniversary? And it's 10, TIN, 10. So so I would like to know, if I were to give you a gift, what is an item that you'd really like that's made of tin?
I think the most practical thing that anyone can give that's made out of tin is tinfoil. You can just make tinfoil hats. You can grill with it. So I think some tinfoil would be a great object made out of tin. What about you? 10 pieces of tinfoil.
10 pieces of tinfoil. I'll go to H-E-B and get you some Reynolds wrap or whatever. Well, my first thing I think about is a cup, a tin cup. Tin is light, and so it's really great for camping and stuff. So
interesting.
You got to have your coffee, no matter where you're at, whether you're in the woods or whether you're at your house. So maybe a tin cup. Well, anyway, excited about episode 10. We hope everyone enjoys this one.
So today's episode is very near and dear to my heart. We are going to be talking about Plato, one of his most famous dialogues called the Phaedo. I guess that rhymes almost. Anyway, it's a very famous dialogue. Not only does it discuss the last moment of Socrates' life, where he drinks his hemlock and he dies after being put on death, and the apology, but it also really presents this interesting metaphysical account of the human soul. So I guess just to give a little context of how Socrates has found himself in this position. This is, I believe, the third or fourth dialogue in a series of collections. The first one is the Euthyphro. So Socrates has been called to court basically, and he's been called to, I guess, appear before a group of judges, and he has this discussion about piety. The next one is the trial of Socrates, probably the most famous out of the bunch, called the Apology. That means defense speech in Greek, or something to that extent. The third one is the Credo, or the Crito. That's just a discussion with one of Socrates' pupils about how Socrates should or why he should not escape, even though he has the chance from his death. And finally, this is the Phaedo, where Plato is thinking about death and because he's about to die. Mr. Parsons, do you have anything to add on this before we launch into the discussion?
So the last couple of episodes, we've been talking specifically about books. We talked about Falling Upward, Father Roar. Last episode with our guest Carson, we talked about mini Nietzsche books. And so if you're interested in the books that we're talking about, we do have a list on our website at opendoorphilosophy.com. But also the thing to point out with this particular dialogue that we're talking about today is that it's not a book. This dialogue will be found in a collection of dialogues. So if you go to Amazon, if that's your place, and you type in Phaedo, it will pop up, but know that it will come as a part of a collection rather than a specific book, because it's probably only maybe 70 pages or so.
Yeah, it's very short.
So it's short. Andrew, before we get further into this, tell us a little bit about how Plato writes. Like what is a dialogue?
Yeah, so something interesting that Plato does in all of his dialogues, I believe, he uses this mouthpiece of Socrates to write. And there's usually, I guess there always, for it to be a dialogue, there's a certain interlocutor or person that Socrates is kind of debating against too. In the Republic, he argues against this guy named Thrasymachus and Glaucon, a bunch of people. In Crito, he discusses with Crito, and Phaedo, he's discussing with a few people. Now, there's a lot of historical, or I guess not historical, but a lot of analysis on why Plato's actually using this method. But I think my favorite, which I've kind of alluded to before in previous episodes, is that the dialogue, one, it makes the reader feel like they're a part of the conversation, which is great. These are very easy to read, by the way, I think, at least to get through. But secondly, it offers a great kind of method for practicing philosophy, thinking about the arguments and such. Mm-hmm. I think that often in these arguments, we see that there are points to disagree with Socrates about. And I think Plato is specifically using these opportunities to kind of engage with the reader and ask them to question Socrates and provide room for kind of commentary, I guess, on the reader's part, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and as a follow-up question, we say this is Plato's dialogue, yet in all these dialogues, the person who's really doing the talking is the character of Socrates. So when we say Socrates says this, is that Socrates talking or is that Plato talking? Because we call it Plato's dialogue.
I think I'm going to give it an answer that you taught me a few years ago. So I think the dialogues of Plato are kind of traditionally ascribed to being from three periods. So at least in the beginning, we're pretty sure that although Plato is writing the dialogues, he is kind of recounting the ways that, or something to the extent which Socrates said. And then in the middle and late dialogues of Plato, they're almost certainly different. Like the philosophies would just be very much contradicting. And, you might say, well, was Socrates even alive? Yeah, Socrates was alive. This practice of using the mouthpiece of someone, even though, and kind of recounting what they're saying, but not taking a literal account, was very common in Greek literature. There's a book, Thucydides' Histories. He gives this funeral oration from Pericles, and that is not even close to being word for word, but they were both kind of sophists. So Thucydides knew the type of style and techniques that Pericles would have used, and he was there, so he could recount it to somewhat extent, but it's not literal, but it gets behind that message. So we see this in Greek literature from this time, so it shouldn't be that surprising. So throughout this dialogue, as Socrates is thinking about his own death, his friends, I believe, keep asking him why he's so calm, and he this is kind of built on the foundational idea that Socrates believes that his soul is immortal, indestructible, and deathless. And he gives a number of arguments for them, but I think his most compelling, his most interesting, certainly, can be found at the end of the book, which is kind of a collection and answers kind of the flaws that his interlocutors poked in earlier arguments. But yeah, the basic idea of the argument is that the soul is immortal, indestructible, and deathless.
Okay, so before we get any further on that, so so what does Socrates slash Plato mean when they use that word soul? Because there's so much in our usage of the word today. There's so many different meanings to it. Like a religious person, when they say soul, they believe in some essence that is uniquely them that will transcend death. Metaphysically, like outside of religion, we might use it to indicate like someone's life force, or we might mean it to be someone's, say, their consciousness, or like the emotional seat of human nature. But even in culturally, we use it in phrases like, man, I'd love to have some soul food. Or we might say of a song we heard, we might be like, yeah, that song's got a lot of rhythm, but it doesn't have any soul. So there's lots of different usage of this word. So when we talk about Plato in this dialogue, what are they talking about when they say
Yeah,
soul?
that's a really good question. In some extents, it can also be a good objection to Socrates' argument, which we can go over a little bit later. I think that there's two ways of thinking about how Plato would think of the soul. One is the traditional Greek account, where it's, I believe the word that he uses in the dialogue is suke. This means something like soul slash mind. So the Greeks, when they were thinking about the soul, they were thinking, this is almost a pun, that the soul was what was doing the thinking. That's how we were understanding, coming to know. That was what was making decisions for us. So when we kind of think about the mind, we think about it being located, I guess, in the brain or something. But the Greeks thought the soul was the mind, wherever that would be in the body. I guess that doesn't really matter. But yeah, so I think that's a good-ish account of kind of what the soul would mean. Another way of thinking, Socrates does give some qualities kind of behind it. And I was thinking of this question too. I was like, what the heck does Plato mean by soul? So I asked my professor. He told me that the best way that you can get it from this dialogue, at least how Plato explains it, is it's something which is alive and something which makes other things alive. Now I think there's problems with that, and we can go over them later. But do you think there's anything to add, Mr. Parsons?
No, I don't think so. I think that covers it. I do think of the word logos, which might be a different word than soul, but I know that logos. Well, I know that Socrates, and then by extension, other philosophical traditions that come out of Greece, like Stoicism, that they refer to the mind as the ruling part. And I know, Plato was a rationalist and believed that our rational part was the ruling part and gave us control over our emotions and our appetites, our urges. So all that makes sense. That's
Okay.
good.
Yeah. So I think in episode 2, I believe we went over kind of the metaphysics behind the theory of forms. And that's really important in this argument. I think it's one of the first times that Plato goes over this. But how he thinks about forms is really integral into how he thinks that the soul is, I guess, deathless. That's where he brings it first. So let's think about the form of life for a second. Mr. Parsons, what would you think of something when we think about the form of life? Like, what would you think that things functions as? Like, what's the purpose of the form of life for Plato?
I mean, I know what Plato thought. What do I think? Which is, I do think we all have purposes that we impart, ascribe to ourselves, that we decide for ourselves. But I don't know that there's a grand metaphysical, cosmological, whatever you want to call it, a divine specific plan or purpose to our lives, other than like some very broad generalities like caring for others, loving others. I think is a part of that, which is part of caring, I guess. But I don't think there's anything really specific other than that to do good for yourself and to do good for others.
Okay. So yeah, I think that Plato is coming in this dialogue certainly with the assumption that everything has a purpose. Two things, I guess. Everything has a purpose, and that purpose is given by forms. So reflect back to episode 2, where we kind of talked back about the theory of forms a little bit more. And so the forms are what gives something its purpose for Plato. So I guess to an extent, or it's making it exist how it does, thus giving, I guess, sort of its purpose. So if we think about like a tree, for example, that's, I guess, our favorite example that we've used. What is not only giving that tree like what it looks like, what it is, how we can come to know the tree, that's the forms in one sense, but what also is making the tree internally what it is, its function and its purpose, is the forms itself, right? So if we think about the form of life just kind of floating around there, and we look at everything that is alive, it seems very likely that the form of life is what's making all of these things alive. So this can be from a tree to a cat to our soul. Now, something important to think about for Plato is that he thinks the soul is what makes something alive. So the form of life is not giving life to the body, it's giving life to the soul. Now, why might we think this is true? Can the body die? It would seem quite clearly yes. Bodies die all the time. Like the human body dissolves, it will die, it goes. Death is a common thing like we've seen in our last episodes, right? But it seems like Socrates believes the soul can't die. Like, does this seem pretty logical so far, Mr. Parsons?
Yeah, so let me try to summarize what I think I understand you've said. So there are things that exist in our world. Those things are all around us. Some things are living, some things are inert, like a rock, but some things are living, like trees, animals, plants, animals, and humans. And so the thing that is living is not necessarily the human body or the animal body. The thing that is living is the soul that is within that body.
Right, exactly.
Okay. And once the body dies, as all things that are living die, it's the soul would, I guess, then continue on because, well, I don't know. You pick it up from there. Did I recap it?
Yeah, the recap is exactly what Plato is thinking. Like that, I think that's something that's just kind of a natural phenomenon that we can observe around us. Things die. But how does Plato really come to the idea, right, that there's something that's giving life? Like that, why does there have to be a soul, right? Well, if we think about life, let's at least come to the assumption or the agreement that something is alive and then something can die, right? Things are alive and then they die.
Things come into existence and things come out of existence.
Right, yeah. So if we think about the idea of life, right, there's something almost contradictory about the idea that something that is alive can die. So Plato thinks that this is almost contradictory because life is what's called an essential property for something, right? So this is really interesting, I think, but it's very confusing. So I'm going to use the best example that I can think of, which is snow. So think about snow. If you go like walk around in the snow barefoot, it's going to be really cold, right? Really, no matter what you do, snow is going to be cold, right? But snow, basically, what I'm trying to say is snow can never not be cold, right? I mean, you can introduce heat to it, but at that point, snow just isn't snow anymore. It turns into water once snow is hot. So you can never really introduce heat to snow because then snow will just burn up and die or whatever, right? Like it'll just disappear. And so, in the same way, I think what Plato wants to do is say, just as snow can't exist without the property of coldness, something like the soul can't exist without the property of life. Now, I think what everyone's thinking at this point is, Andrew, like, okay, you haven't shown that there's a soul, and you just said you were going to prove that there's a soul that exists. But I guess my point, what I'm trying to show is that if there is something like a body that lives and then dies, there must be something in it that remains alive, that doesn't die, which is giving life to my body. I don't know if this makes sense at all, Mr. Parsons. Is this kind of making sense?
Oh boy, if you're looking for me to bail you out, we're gonna have a boat full of water. Um, this is it really is a very difficult concept that Plato puts forth here as to why he believes that there is a soul. I do like your example of the snow. Like snow can't exist without snow being cold, and so that is an essential property of snow. Once that property leaves it, it's no longer snow, right? And so I guess maybe, and tell me if I'm not getting this right, a human body has certain essential qualities, and one of those essential qualities is a soul.
Yeah.
And once the body dies, i.e., once the snow melts, yeah, no, I don't know if I'm following that right.
Okay.
Am I
Right.
close?
Yeah, you're really close. I think there's two parts which are making it difficult to grasp. I think one is my explanation of it, but I think two really is Plato doesn't do he makes this, at least from my reading. Honestly, I think I'm reading it. I think if I read this for 80 more years, I'll figure it out. But I think I'm going to bail myself out here. I think Plato does assume that we have a soul. I think all the Greeks from this time assume that humans have a soul because
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
I was
go
going to
ahead.
say from my reading of it this week, that part of the argument is never quite questioned.
Yeah.
From an argument standpoint, I'm like, oh, so we're starting from the point of a soul does exist,
Yeah.
and then we get into like more interesting questions of like, well, maybe where does it come from, or where does it go, and but like the bottom line is, it is accepted that a soul does exist.
Yeah. So I think that we can think about why the soul exists. Like I think we could say like yeah, he does assume the soul exists. But if we go back and think about what we were saying about the mind, like we don't really question the mind exists now, right? That's what's doing our thinking. I mean, I guess we could argue that the brain is the mind. Topic for another episode for sure. But just hang with me for this one, right? Like we don't question that the mind exists. I think in much the same way, that's how the Greeks are thinking about the soul.
Right.
But the argument that I'm still going upon, I think still kind of stands because what I was trying to prove earlier is that because something in us can't die, although the body dies, that means that there has to be something in us which exists. Plato's that still necessitates that there's something in us which can't die, which I think is Plato's argument. Let me try to come at this with a different angle, and I think this will make more sense. So let's for this moment assume that there is a soul in the body, right? So if we say that the soul exists, right? And the soul is what is alive in our body. It's what causes us to be alive. If we take away the soul from the body, The body is just not alive. So the soul is what's alive. Now, what's giving the property of liveness to the soul is the form of life, right? So the soul itself is alive. I'm starting to sound like an abstract, like crazy philosopher right now.
Well, this is what happens.
Oh my gosh.
Hey everyone, Mr. Parsons here. We hope you're enjoying the show, and here's just a quick reminder that if you like what we're doing, go ahead and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a positive review. It helps us grow the community around open door philosophy. And here's a sneak preview for episode 11, where we'll be discussing the ancient Roman thinker Cicero and his dialogue on friendship. It should be a good one. We hope to see you there. And now back to the episode. Well, okay. In the Phaedo, doesn't Plato actually talk about things that we can see and things we can never see? Like, I want to say there's some point where he says like we can never see the soul. We can see ourselves, but we can never see the soul. And that's the difficulty of this argument, right? Is like you're trying to describe something that we can't see.
Right. No, sure. That's definitely an objection. The best objection that I've ever read of this argument is exactly about that point. It's by Dorotha Frede. She's this philosopher, very famous classical philosopher, who argues against a bunch of arguments that people have against Plato's point. And then she's like, okay, all of these arguments are wrong, but the only way that you can have grounds to criticize Plato's idea is say that Plato tries to describe something which he never says what is. So he says that the soul has this quality, this quality, this quality, but he never says what the soul is. So yeah, we can believe that these qualities do exist, but we can also not, and we have no obligation to believe they exist. So for instance, like say I've never seen what a car is, right? And then say Mr. Parsons, I say, hey Mr. Parsons, what is a car? And you tell me, well, a car is red, it has headlight beams, it has windshield wipers. I'm like, okay, that's really cool and everything, but those are all qualities. I could just be thinking that a car looks like a cat or something.
Like you have no idea what I'm talking about, basically. Even though I'm telling you all these qualities, they have no they make no connection with your understanding of things.
No, that's exactly right. So when Plato says the soul, and he does give good arguments for these, which I wish I could articulate. But when he says that the soul is alive, the soul cannot die, and the soul is indestructible, the Frede's objection is that those are all qualities, but it's not really talking about what the soul is.
I don't know how off track this will be, but over the last summer, I read a book called Galileo's Error, and it was all about consciousness and this concept, or rather this field of consciousness called panpsychism, that talks about essential qualities. A panpsychist's argument is that all living things, no, in fact, all things, have a degree of consciousness. Now, it's important to point out a degree of consciousness. Panpsychists would not argue that an atom has the same level of consciousness as a human being. So degrees, of course. But one of the arguments is that is from a scientific standpoint, and the author Philip Goff says that from a scientific standpoint, we can talk about what an atom does, like an atom spin, and they bounce off of other atoms. So we talk about, we define what an atom is by what an atom does. But his point is like, that's great, science can tell us that, but science does not tell us what an atom is. And maybe that's kind of what you're talking about a bit with the soul. Like you can't ever really say what it is.
Yeah. So I think you've done two things with that explanation. One, I think you've perfectly illustrated Frede's criticism of Socrates, and I think you've also answered her objection. in the same light. But it seems like we can't know what the soul is. It's completely, well, I don't know if I'd argue this, but it seems like it's out of our experience. And thus, it seems kind of like it's ridiculous that we try to ascribe essential qualities to it. But I think, kind of like you stated, I don't think it's crazy to think we still can't understand qualities of things that we don't naturally understand the nature of. So I don't know if that Freddie's objection is necessarily binding.
Yeah, there are a number of things in our existence that we don't really understand. We know that they exist. We may or may not be able to see them. There's a lot of things that we can't see that we think we understand. Certainly, mathematics is a good example of that. When you
Exactly.
talk about geometry,
Yep.
a perfect circle, a perfect right angle, these types of things. I also think of Nagel's famous essay on what it's like to be a bat.
Yep.
We can see a bat, we can observe a bat, but we can never really truly understand the inner experience of what it's like to be a bat. We don't know what it's like to see with sonar. We don't know what it's like to fly, and certainly live nocturnally, et cetera, et cetera. So we do imagine and try to use reason to make observations about things that we will never observe and or experience. And so the soul is just like another example of that. And so, if we're going to make assumptions about like, what our dogs think about and feel, is I mean, at least we can observe a dog and we can see that they wag their tail and all that kind of stuff, but we don't really know what it's like to be a dog. And I guess maybe that's a counter argument.
No, I think that's a perfect example. Exactly what I was going for. So think about the concept of infinity, right? We can't know what infinity is. It's literally indefinable because we can never say, "Oh, infinity is like 10,763," or
Right. We'll
something,
never
right?
experience infinity.
Exactly. But we can still come up with characteristics and qualities about what infinity is, right? Like I just said, we know that infinity is indefinable. We know
Right.
that,
It has no beginning and no end.
exactly. So we know all of these characteristics about it. There's more too. I'm not the greatest mathematician in the world, but there's a lot of qualities of infinity, but we don't know what it is. In just the same way, we might not ever be able to experience the soul and really know what it is, but I think it's certainly we can still come to think of arguments about it. Now, something I was just thinking about though is like some people think that infinity is just a concept. I think that too, actually, that infinity is not something real that exists in the universe. There's never going to be an infinite amount of gummy bears or something locked in a room. So that's a
Keep me
con.
away from him.
so so yeah, that's a infinity might be a concept, but it's not necessarily real. And so sure, I don't think that's what Plato's saying.
So in the dialogue, Socrates has these conversation partners. We call them interlocutors in philosophy, who have questions of Socrates in terms of, okay, so taking that a soul does exist. One of the questions is like, well, when it comes into the body, where was it before that? Does the soul exist before it comes to a body? And then his other interlocutor, suggests like, well, what happens to the soul after the body dies? How do we know that it goes on? So
Mm,
what are Plato's arguments to this? Because it's a very important argument for Socrates, who is about ready to die.
yeah, no, it's extremely important. So Socrates, yeah, he's about to die. So what he thinks, very interesting, and I think it sets a long legacy actually for these Greek and Roman philosophers. He believes the soul exists, has always existed, and will forever exist. The soul is immortal and indestructible. So yeah, he thinks that the soul is always there, will always be around. Plato believes in something like reincarnation.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. Does his theory imply reincarnation?
Yes, yeah. So he does argue in one of his dialogues that reincarnation is a thing. So that's very interesting. But let's think about this for a second about why he thinks the soul is immortal. Simmias comes up to Plato and he's like, hey, yeah, this is a great argument for why the soul exists, but how do we know the soul will always exist, right? So think about like your favorite shirt. You can take it off, you can take it off and wear it, take it off and wear it, take it off and wear it. But eventually you're going to wash it enough times that the shirt, I don't know, rips apart or is just kind of torn apart by the water, right? So why do we have reason? We can have reason to think the soul exists after death, but we don't have really much reason to think why it's necessarily exist forever. I think that's definitely something Socrates needs to be thinking about. I think the best argument that Plato gives for why it must is that he thinks, if the soul cannot die, right, he would almost immediately follow that the soul is immortal. For Plato, an object is only destroyed, ceases to exist, whatever, when it has died. That kind of logically makes sense, right? But if we think that the soul, this is kind of some logical trickery, I think, that Socrates pulls out of thin air. If the soul cannot die, and if something can only be destroyed if it has died, then it follows that the soul cannot be destroyed. I think the argument's certainly valid. This is a very long-winded expression of saying the soul is always existing, will exist, and currently exists. What do you think about that, Mr. Parsons? Does that strike you as plausible?
With any of these types of arguments, my first question is always, well, where did the soul come from to begin with? If it's always existed, this is, as we understand the workings of our universe, cause and effect, the law of causation, something always results from something else. An action always results from some other previous action. And it's the very same argument whether we're talking about the origin of the universe, whether we're talking about where God came from, or whatever. If we say God has always existed, well, that's great, but our understanding about the law of causation is that everything is always caused. Something always causes something else. So if that's true of everything in the universe, then what caused God? And this seems like the same argument with the idea that the soul has always existed. If that's true, great. But why is in this one case the law of causation not in play? So that's kind of my criticism of it, is like, okay, cool, souls exist and always have. Mm-hmm. I can go with that, but like, where do souls come from?
Yeah. So I think you're reminding me of something. I think maybe Aristotle prefaces this in his book on the soul. By the way, this is a very interesting fact. In ancient times, in antiquity, this book was not called the Phaedo, but it was called De Anima, which means on the soul. But I think that it was changed. Maybe this is wrong. It was changed to the Phaedo, maybe because Aristotle has the same book by the same name, De Anima, which is very famous.
Well, right. A lot of the dialogues are named after characters in the dialogue too, so maybe they're kind of keeping with that tradition.
Yeah.
Well, Andrew, this has been a wide-ranging conversation about the Phaedo by Plato. It's really complicated. We've addressed the fact that some of these concepts are really out there. So how about this question? Why is Plato just not some crazy guy? Why is this like some great respected dialogue by him, instead of people thinking like, oh, he's just some old man spouting out ridiculous ideas?
No, great question. When I was first reading Plato, I was like, forms. That's some old concept by the Greeks that has no application now. It's kind of ridiculous. But when you read these arguments, and I hope everyone does, it's like, you need to consider that these things might actually exist, and try to, the burden needs to be on you, I think, to disprove these arguments and come up with a good reason why they're not true. So I think there's a tendency for Plato, especially for an argument such as this, to be like, this is ridiculous. The soul doesn't exist. But think about why you think that. This might be like our practical reasoning of the day. because this isn't just some fun experiment. Socrates is in the last moments of his life. This is continuing on, I guess, from our, so it's 2 weeks ago or so. But think about, like, why is this argument wrong? Why do we have reason to believe that this is not true? I think, right? Like, I think there is reason to believe that this might be true. And I think that, there's later philosophers like Augustine and Aquinas who adopt some of these ideas as, yeah, I think there is forms that exist, albeit in God. But yeah, I think there's certainly reason to believe that this argument might exist. So this is Andrew's spout on why classics is important still today. But yeah, I think it's easy to dismiss these arguments based on a presupposition that the Greeks are wrong, they're old, they're outdated. But that's a logical flaw if I've ever seen one. Yeah, Mr. Parsons, what do you think? Why do you think Plato's some old crazy dude?
Well, he may have been an old crazy dude, but he's one of the most brilliant ones. There's going to be, so, with philosophy, you're going to have a hard time finding a philosopher that you agree with on everything 100%. I would wager you won't.
Except yourself.
Except yourself, of course. But, Plato is so foundational in philosophy in terms of methodology, certainly, but also in terms of just rationalistic ideas. And when you combine him with Aristotle, you just have this tremendous foundation of Western thought. So he's important from that perspective. Whether or not you agree with him in terms of whether or not there's a soul, well, that's the work of philosophy itself. Go get the dialogue, go read it, and you challenge Plato's conclusions. You challenge his premises, and that's the work of philosophy, not whether or not you come to agreement with Plato. And that's probably why Plato is so great, is that there's so much to dig into. Again, I feel like that's kind of the work of philosophy, is the digging into, not necessarily coming to agreement. And it's through that work that, a person is able to find their own philosophical voice, which ultimately helps us, live a more reasoned life.
I think that's certainly right. I'm going to end, I think, with this, at least for what I have to say. Echoing that, I've been told recently, I think this is true, that philosophers are in the business of explanation. They're not in the business of, oh yeah, this is what seems true, or I guess they could be, but people just want to explain what is. And if you want to engage with them, and I think you should, the place to start always is asking why.
Well, then I think we are done with Phaedo and the wrestling with the question of whether or not we have an immortal soul. There'll be more to say on it in future episodes. No doubt it's one of the biggest questions in philosophy, but that's Plato's take. And that means it's time to head over to the quote corner. Okay, welcome to the quote corner, everybody, a segment of our show where we take a philosophical quote and rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. This is my week, and I wanted to pick something that was kind of funny. So one of the great Stoic philosophers is a guy by the name of Epictetus, and his dialogues. The fun thing about Epictetus is he's a little sassy from time to time. So this is a particularly sassy quote. So it deals with people, wanting God to solve their problems. So here's the quote. "Please God, we say, relieve me from my anxiety. Listen, stupid, you have hands. God gave them to you himself. You might as well get on your knees and pray that your nose won't run. A better idea would be to wipe your nose and forgo the prayer. The point is, isn't there anything God gave you for your present problem? You have the gifts of courage, fortitude, and endurance. With hands like these, do you still need somebody to help you wipe your nose?" So that's from Epictetus Dialogue, Book 2, Chapter 16. So that's a fun one.
Yeah, this takes the cake for the funniest quote from the quote quarter, I think. Definitely shows you the sassiness of Epictetus. I'm just going to I'm gonna give it 5.
I'm going to discuss it. You're just dropping 5. Boom.
Yeah, I'll explain after you, but
Okay.
yeah, it's a 5 for me.
Well, one thing I would love to know is like exactly what other words might be translated for that word stupid. I mean, is he just frustrated with his students? So I guess it's something to point out about his dialogues. Epictetus did not write anything down. His students are the ones who recorded his lectures. So he must have been in a bad mood. I know as a teacher, sometimes I want to say, "Hey, you idiot, just turn in your work and stop making excuses."
Probably with me a lot of the time. Back in the day.
I'm sure not. But anyway, outside of that, this in a way, I don't know. There's a couple of things. You have the concept of the diffusion of responsibility, right? So it's like, oh, I just can't handle this situation. Someone needs to handle it for me. So I'm going to appeal to God. Please help me. And that's fine and that's great. But I think Epictetus is like, but take a look at yourself real quickly and see whether or not you have the tools to handle this already. See that the tools are already within you. There's no one you need to ask for help from. You've got the tools to do it. Now there is some question in terms of, things we're not addressing here with Epictetus, with things like, mental depression or diagnosed anxiety. He uses that word, relieve me from my anxiety. So there are some things that are, your chemical makeup of your body. But I think at the end of the day, Epictetus is like, hey man, just stop your whining and get to it. Whatever task is in front of you that you find impossible, you have within you the tools to handle it. So handle it. It's like tough talk from dad.
Yeah, I mean, Epictetus was a slave before, I guess he was a big philosopher. So it kind of reminds me of those kind of memes, I guess, where it's like back in my day,
right?
Like, or like where they're showing like the grandfather. The grandfather is like fighting the Nazis and the kid is complaining about his Xbox not turning on or something, right?
Right.
Like Epictetus, if Epictetus is saying this, like he's saying, stop complaining. Like you can do what you need to do, I guess. Like this guy had it rough. And so it seems like, he's definitely in the position to talk about this. He's not a Seneca, who by means is very smart but very wealthy and has a lot of things. This guy's been through the run of the mill.
Yeah, Epictetus was a slave before he became a philosopher, and I don't think philosophy was the highest paying job back in the day.
No,
but I also want to say he had a limp.
Yeah, his slave owner was particularly known for being brutal, and as a child, supposedly, his master twisted his leg as a punishment, and he kept twisting because Epictetus wasn't showing any emotion. This is supposedly, probably not true because he wasn't crying or anything. And Epictetus, you're right, yeah. So Epictetus said something like, you're not going to want to go too far, or my leg is going to snap. And the guy snapped his leg, and Epictetus didn't cry. So supposedly he had this limp all his life.
So from a guy who is a slave and is limping around his entire life, he's telling his students, stop your whining, suck it up, and get it done. Stupid.
Imagine having him as a philosophy teacher.
Oh my gosh, there'd be no room for error. No room for excuse, rather. Like, oh, I'm sorry, I had to work late last night. I couldn't get my homework done. He'd be like, what do you control and what do you not control?
Yeah. Goodness. So what's your rating?
Oh, I'm giving it a 5. Yeah. I think, of course, there's some arguments against it, but sometimes we need some good old straight talking, and Epictetus here is telling us what's up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Well, all right, there you have it, folks.
Alrighty, everybody, that's going to be it for today's episode. Thank you for spending your very precious time left on Earth, at least with your physical body, with us today.
We'd love it if you'd leave a positive review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts so you'll know when new episodes drop, and pass it on to your friends who are part body and soul.
We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to tell us what you think about the show, have a question you'd like for us to discuss, philosophy quote you'd like us to rate, or just wanting to clarify what the heck I said, please email us at opendoorphilosophy@gmail.com.
That's right, and you can follow all the philosophy on Twitter and Instagram and our website at opendoorphilosophy.com, where you can find many things about the show, including links for the books that we discuss.
Let me give a special thanks to Dorothy Frede for a great objection today for us to use. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. And remember, when your life seems in need of some philosophy, the door is always open.